This is a bold claim, and you're probably wondering if I'm going to say major 7 or dominant flat 5 sharp 11 arpeggios, but this is a bit different and a lot more useful. The way you think about arpeggios and practice them is likely getting in the way of getting your solos to sound like jazz. In the beginning, everyone is telling you to practice arpeggios so that you play the right notes over the chord, and that is important, but you have to get away from thinking in full arpeggio positions because that will not make your solos sound better. Instead, you need to start thinking about an arpeggio as a melody, and you have to start learning how to play them so that they can sound like jazz. But for that, you need to practice them the right way. This is not yet one of the 3 arpeggios, but you need this foundation to be able to use them. And in jazz, you don't spend all your time playing arpeggio positions, simply because that's not how you use them in a solo. If you transcribe and analyze jazz solos like this Joe Pass solo, then you will see a lot of arpeggios, but they are 1 octave arpeggios 95% of the time. As you can see, there are a lot of arpeggios, even if Joe Pass says that he doesn't use arpeggios a lot.
First of all, I use very little arpeggio, so you would hear very little of in my playing.
I was always a bit puzzled by this, but I guess he emphasizes that the arpeggios should not be used as things you just run up and down, but as something that you want to use in a melody, which is actually also what you will learn in this video. The easiest way to practice this is to work on the diatonic arpeggios, but instead of just jumping in and practicing the diatonic arpeggios, you can build it up in a few exercises and have a much easier time playing them. This is a 4-step process, and you can use that for any scale, but in this case, I'll use the C major scale. Step 1 is very simple, play the scale. Step 2 is playing the scale in thirds, because as you'll see, the arpeggios are really just stacking thirds on top of each other. And now that we have some diatonic thirds, we can start stacking them, and stacking 2 thirds gives you the diatonic triads, which are also useful for soloing. And finally, step 4 is to play the diatonic arpeggios. I'm not going to pretend that this is something that I came up with. I was taught to practice the diatonic arpeggios by Barry Harris. And as you saw in the Joe Pass solo, this is an essential building block in jazz solos. So let's first look at some of the ways to make it sound good, and then add another important bebop trick. And that one is one of the most important arpeggios to learn. The first thing to do is to transfer this to the chord progression. For this video, I'm just going to use a 2-5-1 in C major. A complete song might be a bit long. Start with just the basic arpeggios of each chord. And then you can start practicing making licks with this. Start rubato and then compose lines that you think sound good. Keep it basic and see what you can come up with. Learning to compose lines is a skill you need to develop, but I'm sure you can see how it will help your improvisations sound better. Now, if you can't compose a decent lick, then it's very unlikely that your solos will be full of fantastic phrases. And as you can tell, it's not about the notes, it's about how you make the arpeggios into a melody. So let's look at some of the most important ways to use arpeggios in jazz solos, because that is how you start to sound better. I'm not sure if this is the most bebop arpeggio or if the next one is even more bebop, but this is certainly a great way to change up the flow of your 8th note lines and add some energy to your solo. I'm sure you already know the sound, but here are a few famous examples. So Barney Kessel on a rhythm change. And of course, if you're talking about bebop, then you have to talk about Charlie Parker. So here's an example from his solo on Au Privav, and he actually manages to use this twice just in this short fragment. And I can't imagine that you're interested in jazz guitar and then don't know George Benson's solo on Billy's Bounce. And of course, he uses this a few times in there as well. Here is a great line that I'm sure you want to learn. And all of these 3 are using the arpeggio as a triplet with a leading note. So I'm playing the C major 7 arpeggio, but I'm adding a leading note in front of it. Now in this case, the B is in the scale, but that could also be a chromatic leading note. That depends on which arpeggio you're playing. And then I'm also turning it into a triplet. So which is really adding that energy and that flow towards that last note, making that sort of a nice target at the end of that phrase. In the famous examples that you just listened to, then the arpeggios are not only being played as triplets, they're actually also used in another way that is very practical and that I'll cover later in this video. Now, since it's very common to use this triplet way of playing the arpeggios, then I think it's also worth turning that into a technical exercise so that you really get that into your fingers and into your ears, and that will give you this. And you should start working on using this. Check out how the triplets makes this line sound a lot more exciting. Adding a trill here and there also helps change things up, but that's a technique for another video. The triplet arpeggio was the first important arpeggio. Let's get to the next one, and that is what Barry Harris calls the pivot, which is one of the best ways to get rid of boring lines in your solo. Besides the observation that arpeggios are mostly used as one octave arpeggios and not often as runs over several octaves like a complete position, I think it's also worth pointing out that inversions are pretty rare in jazz solos. There are two other things that replace them, and both work a lot better when it comes to having stronger melodies. The first one is the pivot arpeggio, which is certainly also a candidate for the most bebop arpeggio. You can let me know what you think in the comments when it comes to which one is more bebop. Pivot arpeggios are pretty easy to construct. If you have a C major 7 arpeggio, then all you need to do is to take the first note, the C, and then move that up an octave. And then you get this melody. And now you have a way of playing the arpeggio that is much more interesting with that large skip in the beginning. It's great for getting rid of predictable, boring lines because you have a way of changing direction and surprising the listener. Pivot arpeggios are pretty common, but they're often not recognized, especially by jazz beginners. And that makes a lot of sense actually. If you look at a transcription, then it's very clear when something is an arpeggio, even if it's a triplet arpeggio or something like that. But if you look at a pivot arpeggio, then it's harder to see that that's in fact just a seventh chord. Now, Grant Green uses pivot arpeggios in two different ways, and he plays them very often. So that can be a great place to start to hear them in action. Here's an example on a 2-5-1 in F major. And another great place is Joe Pass in his solo on Just Friends, where he uses it in the pickup. And actually both of these are examples of something else as well, but I'll get to that in a bit. Since you know how the pivot arpeggios are constructed and how that will work for any arpeggio, then you can also see how it's fairly easy to create an exercise for these. Because you go from this, and then you can take each of these arpeggios and move the root up an octave. That will give you this exercise. And now you can start putting it to use in composing lines. The most common arpeggios where you use pivots are major 7 and minor 7 arpeggios. But this example also has one on the 5 chord, besides the major 7 on the 1 chord. Maybe check out some solos and find examples to steal from, like the two that I showed you, and they are both in the PDF that you can download on my website. This was one alternative to inversions, but there is another one that's equally useful and really great if you're just a little bit lazy. A lot of what makes arpeggios strong melodies is that they are stacked thirds, and that is also why inversions are a little bit less effective. They break that pattern and break sort of the balance of the melody. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that you can't ever use inversions, but most of the time you will hear this arpeggio instead. And in fact, you've already heard a few examples of this. The Barney Kessel example that I played a few sections ago is a D minor 7 arpeggio, so over a B flat major 7 chord. And in the power example that comes right after it, then you have a B flat major 7 arpeggio over a G minor 7 chord. And this concept is actually pretty simple. If you look at a C major 7 arpeggio, so C, E, G, and B, and then you take the third of that chord, E. Now the diatonic arpeggio in C major for the E is E minor 7. And that is of course mostly the same notes as C major 7 because it shares E, G, and B. and then it adds a ninth on top, which is the D. But of course, that still sounds great, so that's just a good note to have in there. This means getting a lot more out of your arpeggio exercise, and you want to explore this through progressions to add more arpeggios to your vocabulary. Here I'm playing the 2-5-1, but I also notated the arpeggio from the third, just to make it clear what is being played. But really you would just think the 2-5-1, of course. And if you start using these, you'll have access to many classic bebop sounds. This next example has both the F major 7 arpeggio on the D minor 7 chord and the B half diminished arpeggio on the G7 chord, plus a pivot arpeggio on the C major 7. It is ironic that if you try to be really thorough and learn arpeggios really well with inversions and positions, then you might actually be shooting yourself in the foot. It is melodic techniques like these that really help you get your lines and your playing to sound like jazz. And there are actually similar rules that describe how you should be playing chords when you're comping in jazz. Check out this video so that you're not just playing chord grips without ever grooving or really turning the harmony into the beautiful music that it can be. And trust me, this is what makes jazz chords so fun to play. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.